Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first panel in the conference Changing the Story, Climate Crisis as a Crisis of Imagination. This conference is organized by EIT's Climate Knowledge and Innovation Community and by the School of Ecopoetics at the Institute of Reportage in Warsaw, Poland. I would also like to encourage you to share this event on your social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, invite people to join us for this panel or the next panel that's going to take place immediately after this one. So our first panel is in response to Grzegorz Czemiel's lecture, Why Science Needs Art. And let me introduce myself briefly and the panelists. My name is Marta Werbanowska, and I am currently a postdoctoral assistant at the University of Vienna at the Department of English. My research interests are in Black Studies, environmental humanities, and contemporary poetry. I'm finishing a book on poetry as a way of knowing. So I'm very excited for this panel. And our participants are Julia Fiedorczuk from Poland, who is a poet, writer, translator, researcher, who's an expert on eco-criticism and ecopoetics. She holds an academic post at the Institute of English Studies at the University of Warsaw. Her first poetry collection, Listopad nad Narwią, was awarded the Polish Association of Book Publishers Prize, and she's also a recipient of the Hubert Burda Award in Austria and the Szymborska Prize for her volume Psalmy. She's a co-founder with Philip Springer of the School of Ecopoetics and a columnist for Przekrój and Polityka, Polityka being the most popular Polish weekly, and her last novel was published in 2020. It's titled Pod Słońcem. Her work has been translated into over 20 languages. Piotr Skubała is a professor of biological sciences. He has a PhD from the Faculty of Natural Sciences at the University of Silesia in Katowice. He is a soil ecologist, acarologist, which means that he is dealing with the ecology of Oribatida soil mites. Am I reading this right? And he's an environmental philosopher, educator, climate activist, and an ethics expert for the European Commission in Brussels. He's member of the GMO and GMM Commission working under the Ministry of the Environment, a contributor to monthly magazines Aura, Ochrona Środowiska, and Dzikie Życie, co-organizer of environmental culture festival named Zielonomi, organizer and co-host of meetings held by the Environmental Thought Club. And the Interdisciplinary Research Center for Humanities Education at the University of Silesia recently has awarded him with the coveted title of the greatest humanist among natural scientists. And George Marshall from United Kingdom is the founder of the Climate Outreach and Information Network. He has over 3 decades experience at all levels of communications and advocacy, from community-level protest movements to senior positions in Greenpeace and the Rainforest Foundation, to advisory roles for governments, businesses, and international agencies. He is an award-winning documentary maker and writes regularly on climate change issues, including articles for The Guardian, The New Statesman, New Scientist, and The Ecologist. And he is also the author of Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change, a book that's been published in 2014 by Bloomsbury, and as I've just learned, is about to have its translation into Czech pretty soon. So a warm welcome to all of our panelists. And I hope you won't mind if I'll repeat what Grzegorz did for his lecture and open with a poem, a very short one, a poem by Jane Hirschfield. When his ship first came to Australia, Cook wrote, the natives continued fishing without looking up. unable, it seems, to fear what was too large to be comprehended. And the title of the poem is Climate Change. And I think this connection that Hirschfeld makes in this poem between not only the history of colonialism and the history of global warming and climate change, but also this connection between something very urgent and threatening happening and the people who are about to be affected by it being not only oblivious but unable to imagine the almost cosmic horror of this thing happening is exactly the kind of problem that we are facing today. The inability to process the scale and the urgency of what's going on. And this is where both Grzegorze's lecture and George's call in his book kind of make a similar call for addressing this unthinkability. And I would like to ask all of you, what personal and professional experiences would you like to share with us today about how you have tapped into the synergies of sciences, arts, humanities to address this urgency and to make the unthinkable thinkable for a more general public?
I'm happy to start if you like, Marta.
Absolutely.
Because the point you started with there is also is one which is key to my book, which is this one of a psychology of climate change. And one of the things is in cognitive psychology that you have there are different processing systems within the brain built into actually the architecture of the brain that manage rational, we could say rational decision-making processes. That's sort of the more mathematical and structured way of thinking. And we have processes which would be called affective reasoning, which is for more emotional and story-driven ways of thinking. And the two are constantly in conversation. But the important thing is it's that second one, the affective system, that is most powerful. And so it's possible for us, as the poem is saying, to kind of know something and not know something, to kind of understand it in a way, but not really accept it. And for a long time, it's changing a little now, but for a long time, the situation on climate change was that if you ask people, what do you think about climate change, or are you concerned about climate change, people would actually know quite a lot, and they would tell you about it, and they'd say, yes, I'm concerned about this. But then if you ask them, tell me about the things you're really concerned about or the things which are important to you, nobody would mention climate change. And it was this separation. And I guess for a long time, scientists argued that what people needed was more information. So the model of working was of saying, let's give people more information, or let's find different ways of communicating the science information. And that is simply not the way that our brains work. What our brains need is narrative. This is where the arts come in. We have to find ways of speaking to that creative language story part of our brain. And also, this is very important, we need to be hearing things from our friends and the people within our social groups. So one of the things I would open up for the conversation is it's not just the medium, but it's the messenger. It's who are we hearing this from? And that is a challenge to arts, because often arts are very clever with the medium, but not so clever with the messenger. In other words, if we're reaching wide society, writing a climate change opera is not going to work very well for mobilizing all of society, although it might mobilize opera fans. However, having a football team that takes strong climate action and talks about it and shares what they're doing might. So there are lots of different ways of approaching this. The important thing is we find a way that speaks creatively, but also speaks through messengers who are trusted.
Yuria?
if I can manage to unmute myself, if I could continue this thought, answering your initial question as to my own practice, I am a teacher mostly. I am a teacher of literature. This is what I do most of my life. And so my experience is that of introducing environmental issues into literature classes. And this is already a way in which, I mean, this attempt is in itself an attempt to combine humanities and elements of scientific knowledge. But just as George said a minute ago, it has to do with it has to do also with the context in which this knowledge is appearing, and for some reason, when this knowledge about climate change, right, and the conversation about climate change appears in a literature class, I find that this does have an impact on the students, who obviously all know that climate change is happening, but they are really surprised that this is something that we can talk about in a class on poetry or in a class on literature, right? And then going from there to realize that no conversation today is happening outside of the conversation about climate change. Something happened to George? Or, okay. All right. Because I think that it's crucial for us to have this awareness that no conversation nowadays is happening outside of this conversation about climate change and related planetary crisis, right? Every conversation we're having is a conversation about that, right? So to make it real somehow, to make this truth real, I do begin each of my courses with addressing this question of climate change, because like in this famous title of Naomi Klein, I do believe that it changes everything. It also changes everything when it comes to how we teach, when it comes to how we think about knowledge and how we read literature, how we think about literature, and so on and so forth. So my experience primarily is that of a teacher who introduces this topic as a topic which is not, you know, just one of the classes will be devoted to climate change, but as this meta topic, which is like whatever we're discussing, we're also thinking about this. And also the kind of work or the kind of literature that I tend to discuss recently in my classes. So the newest poetry, 21st century poetry, is very often the kind of work that does address climate change and other environmental issues explicitly. And it's often a kind of work that uses methodology which is inspired by the sciences. So for example, all this new trend in poetry to use research, right? Research-based poetry, which is a big thing now. Quite recently, there's been quite a few books which are based on research that uses actually scientific methods. And so that's another interesting thing in which these themes and ways of knowing can be combined in a literature class. And I do find that this is effective. I mean, not on a large scale, because of course the number of students is limited. Yes, but I do think that education here is important, and I also do think that we need a lot of different kinds of interventions. So a football team is fine, an opera is also fine. A literature class is also like, we need like all hands on board, basically. Yes. So wherever we are, whatever our impact is, I think it's important to combine these possibilities.
Okay, my turn, yeah?
Yes, Piotr, if you would like to add something.
When I heard about the subject of this conference and this panel especially, to which I was invited, I was overjoyed and partly surprised. I didn't think that I would live in time when we would speak loud about things so important for me, which I really feel deeply, for which I did not often find understanding in scientific community, at least in my discipline of biological science, the necessity of cooperation between biological science and humanities, art, is something obvious for me for many years and necessary for me. In my scientific educational activities, when I popularize science, for example, I have always tried to combine science and humanities and art. I often incorporate elements of art, music, poetry, even dance in my scientific lecture, in my scientific workshops, let's say. And I must say that it works. Especially when we think about climate change, environmental crisis, science does not work. Art, poetry, songs, humanities thinking remains in this situation. In this example, climate change, we see the power of literature, of poetry. By combining science and art, we have a chance, only in this way, we have a chance to convince the audience of the content we want to convey them. Only together, science and art are able to change our behavior. Maybe I will present you a kind of my type of working. I begin with science, yeah, science with bigger letter, as Grzegorz Czempiel says, pure science, science, singular science with big letter. I present the lecture on the ecology, on the functioning of the life on the earth. So pure science ecological lecture. I can say I can finish this lecture with, for example, opinion from the textbook on general ecology by Professor January Wajent from Jagiellonia University. I quote, "Mutually beneficial relationships of close symbiosis between two or more species are enormously widespread. They permit modern ecosystems, and their existence has a significant impact on the formation of species diversity in the biosphere." So the first step, science, pure science. Then I put sciences with small letter, humanities, let's say. In this way, I reinforce the message about the functioning of life, about the mystery of the nature of the life on the earth. And for example, recalling the opinion of Lynn Margulis, American evolutionary theorist, biologist, and Dorian Sagan, writer, philosopher, from the book Microcosmos, 4 billion years of evolution from our microbial ancestor. I quote, "Life on Earth did not develop as a result of struggle, but mutual help." And then, when I see that the audience, some students, still does not understand, does not feel the deepest truth about the world around us, about the nature, about the functioning of biosphere, I said the only way is to use poetry, song. Only poetry, song, art remains. And I propose to, for example, to sing a song. To sing a song. For example, one of my favorite songs is "Tall Trees." Tall trees, warm. I'm not going to sing, but I write. Tall trees, warm fire, strong winds, deep water. I feel it in my body. I feel it in my soul. Or one of my favorite Polish song. The title is Song of Unity. We are of one earth. We are of one blood. We are of one water. We are of one tear. We are one fire. We are one dream. We are one body. We are one day. And I must say it works. Pure science, only scientific data, without emotions, without humanity, song, poetry, or dance. There is no chance to change the world, to stop climate crisis. So I'm really happy that we talk about this, because there's no future if we still work separately. Science with big letter and sciences with small letter.
Thank you all for sharing your responses. And I think this example with which Piotr concluded, it actually harks back to what George was saying about this kind of medium is one thing, the messenger is another. Because of course, in a classroom setting, you know, Piotr or Yulia, you remain like, you know, professors, right? It's but the form of knowledge that you bring in, popular culture, folk, vernacular, appeals in a different way as a different knowledge, in a way in which this kind of elite knowledge production of science, you know, somewhere up there in the ivory tower, may not. And I would like to ask you if you think, or how do you think those kind of different types of messengers, meaning from vernacular knowledge, poetic knowledge, scientific knowledge, how they can be effectively combined to create this planetary vision, or if you agree that this kind of planetary vision that Grzegorz is talking about in his lecture, is this one of those key things for our climate imagination that we need now? And how can we create it in a way that's not totalitarian, but based on symbiosis, relationality?
I can start this time if it's okay. Yeah, because one thing which I think emerges out of what we said in response to your first question is that knowledge is not the same as information. Like knowledge does not come down, cannot be reduced to just information, because we know we have a lot of information. We know we have probably too much information from various sources, but knowledge is something else, right? And knowledge has this affective level. It has perhaps a bodily level. Yes, it is about experience. It is about having taken something to heart. It is perhaps about values also. Okay, so so I think this is perhaps an obvious thing, but I think it's worth articulating that when we speak about this conversation between the so-called hard sciences and the kind of information that science gives us, and the kind of understanding that science gives us, and the arts, we're speaking about building a more complete way of knowing, yes, or a more multiple way of knowing that involves information, that involves experience, that involves values, that involves emotions, that involves ethics, perhaps, right? That involves having taken something to heart, having thought about something, having lived something. So I think this is clear to all of us, and that clearly emerges out of what we have already said. I think that this planetary vision, or working towards this planetary vision, requires a very, very profound revolution in education. I think it requires a very profound change in how we create knowledge. So education is, for me, perhaps because I come from this background, education for me is fundamental. I do believe that it's very, very important to work towards transdisciplinary approaches, to work to work towards interdisciplinary approaches. This is one of the ambitions of the School of Ecopoetics, by the way, right? One of our aspirations is to create a kind of space where we can work towards this very, very radically transdisciplinary kind of knowledge. And another aspect of this change, or another aspect of this revolution in education, is how we build knowledge in terms of making it more like involving more active participation of the students. Because I also think that this sort of model of knowledge transmission, where you stand in front of the classroom and you teach to people and you just give them, you give them more information, that this is completely obsolete. Yes, that it's not working anymore. So how we create knowledge, how we make this knowledge that will constitute the grounds for this planetary awareness, for this planetary vision, yes, this also needs to be rethought. So transdisciplinarity is one thing, but another thing is ways of teaching, or ways of transmitting, or ways of creating, or ways of collaborating on knowledge production. And I also think from the other side that the way in which we make art also needs to change. Because, for instance, when it comes to poetry, I don't think the traditional model of lyric poetry, which is about self-expression, is very adequate, right? And a lot of people feel this, yes, that the way in which we make art also requires a different sort of contact with, a different sort of engagement, a different sort of showing up for experience than traditionally, let's say, yes. So I would say that that changes are needed on all of these levels, and we have to think about all of these levels simultaneously. For me, education is crucial, right? And changes in education are crucial on all levels of education if we are to work towards these planetary visions. I think a lot of work needs to be done. I think we are at the very beginning. It's wonderful that we're having this conversation, and that this conversation is happening not just here, it's happening all over the place. Everybody's saying this. So like everybody's saying now, we need to have this dialogue between arts and sciences. We need to change the way we know things. But I think we're at the very beginning of this journey towards actually, working out the methods of teaching and the forms of collaboration. They already begin to emerge, but these forms of collaboration, I think they need to be worked out.
Thank you, Julia. Piotr?
Maybe it will be interesting example for you of cooperation between science, ecology in my example, and sciences, humanities, art. Interesting example of this, as Julia said, transdisciplinarity. In 2004, I had a lecture on the title was "Living on the Symbiotic Planet: A Comet Against Nature Red in Tooth and Claw." It was on the international conference, the title "Towards a New Renaissance: Human Values, Spirituality and the Future." It was at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. One of the conference participants was Professor Marek Osiewicz. Professor Marek Osiewicz is now at the University of Minnesota in the United States. He's a literary scholar in the field of American literature and culture. Probably he listened to our conversation now from USA. 1 year later, he invited me to give a lecture at the international conference. It was in Wrocław. The title of this conference, "Towards or Back to Human Values, Spiritual and Moral Dimensions of Contemporary Fantasy." So I have a lecture on ecology, about the mystery of life on the Earth, about the functioning of our planet. And this lecture was to the representative of fantasy literature all over the world. So for me, strange, fantastic experience to speak to the representative of fantasy literature about the secret of the functioning of life. Later, Professor Marek Oziewicz revealed why he invited me to this conference, especially, and he explained me that when he listened to my lecture in Krakow, he was surprised because he knew from the literature this vision of the world. You know that life is unity, that every species is connected, that every species is important, that mutual help is the most important item in the functioning of life on the earth, and so on. The vision of life, which is really optimistic, the vision of the life of the symbiosis on this planet. He thought that this kind of vision is only in the literature, that the world, the nature is different, you know, cruel and so on. And it appears that ecology explained this in this way, that the most important thing is symbiosis, mutual help, and the nature is really friendly. So I think it's a good example of cooperation between science, ecology in this example, and literature or art. We even have one chapter in one book published in Cambridge. The title is "Do We Live on the Symbiotic Planet? Ecological Principles of Life on Earth and Their Literary Implication." So in my life, you know, contact, experience with scientists from humanity disciplines are really important, and I hope that the future belongs to the I see that the future in cooperation between scientists, which give solution, and humanities which can implement this solution in our imagination. Thank you.
Thank you. George, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to come to something I think that you were saying, Marta. This word elite. I think we need to be very careful of saying what do we need to say and who do we need to speak to. Climate change poetry is not going to get us far towards building a public mandate for climate action. I like poetry. I have friends who are poets, but we need to recognize that the need is to reach people. And therefore the question is, what is the best way of reaching people? That's the important thing. The need is not to mobilize the arts. The need is to find a way that the arts can reach people to mobilize them. And I think that is the priority. So the question I always ask is this a good way of reaching people? Does it speak to them in a way which speaks to their emotional narrative sense? And are we reaching the right people? Because part of the issue for our own societies is that we have a very wide distribution of attitudes to climate change. All societies are to some degree polarized on climate change. obviously some more than others, North America very much, but Poland has a political polarization on climate change, for example. My own country, Britain, has a polarization. People who are right-wing are more skeptical than left-wing. People who are older are more than younger. Men more than women. So if we can imagine, for example, an older white man conservative in a rural area, this is the kind of person we really have to be reaching. And so my question is, how do we reach them? And are there arts which reach them, or are there better ways of reaching them in some different way? So I've seen a lot of really interesting work done on combining the arts with the sciences and doing very, very innovative and interesting work, and I welcome that. I think again, I think, as we were hearing before from Julia, I think, you know, the more the better. Yeah. All of the above, but where the absolute priority has to be, I think, is in finding ways of reaching the people who are currently at the edge of a conversation. And that can also include the arts, but the kind of arts which speak to them are not going to be elite arts, I would suggest. It might be things, for example, like popular music. It might be through the medium of soap opera, for example, and you know, of television drama. Here in Britain, by the way, we've had a very interesting initiative to bring climate change into this kind of mainstream television material. So we have in Britain, soap operas are very, very big. We have maybe 4 major ones which are watched by more than half the population, and it's been very clever just bringing these in as a theme without making it into a lecture. And I think this is how we build support for climate change. But it's something which is in people's lives around them, not something that they are making an effort to listen to, but it becomes part of their cultural environment. So I guess the thing which I'm saying on here is, let's think very broadly by how we define art, and let's make sure that the priority is that it is about reaching people to galvanize them into action and support. That for me is the absolute priority. Oh, and I should finally say this point about having a shared vision. Yes, I think we need to have a shared sense that this is a major threat we need to mobilize around. But I think it's healthy for us to have very different ideas about what we do and how we respond to it. We don't all have to agree about the world and how we think the world is and how we want and the changes we want to make. I think there's a very strong tendency, particularly of climate change advocates from the left wing, to say we want climate change to talk about social justice and to talk about you know, much wider issues of fighting for equality in society. That's fine. They should say that, of course, and I agree with many of those ideas. But what I should say is that also alienates people who are more conservative. So I think it's healthy for us to have very different ideas about what we think the vision is and where we want to go. We have a meta narrative, which is we have a problem, but we face this, we have this in common. We are all members of our country, of our society, of humanity. We all share this so much in common, and we have to come together on this, and we all have something to contribute. That's the main one. Then within that, we may have very different ways of talking. And I think it's healthy if there is friction between those. And actually, if we talk about the arts, I think it's healthy if within the arts, there are very different ways of talking about climate change. We really don't want to, I really don't want to see a single way of talking.
No, if I can add bottom, no, that would be the end of arts. I mean, if we created sort of like a standard way of speaking or standard story that everybody has to adhere to, that would be the end of arts. I think that's the very opposite to what art can do best, which is precisely complicate the conversation, right? Which is precisely provide a variety of voices. Sure. I mean, I agree with what you said about, I kind of almost agree with what you said about poetry being incapable of reaching a wide audience and making change. But I also think that before this conversation, like, okay, for this for a serious conversation about climate to become mainstream, it has to happen somehow, right? And so one step is to start talking about it and to stop pretending that it's not happening. So for example, for myself, I am a scholar of literature. I teach literature. That's what I do. That's where I am. And so for me, what this means is that I talk about it in my literature classes. So I mean, so the thing is, let's not pretend that it's not happening. And then, okay, sure, the kind of work that we discuss in class is probably not it's probably not very useful for, I don't know, banners, people will not carry it to demonstrations, yes? But this is how it becomes part of everyday thinking. This is how it becomes part of everyday conversations. And then you never know who that person talks to next. Yes, maybe it's the guy that you want to reach. I don't know. Then people say also there's been research which suggests that climate deniers are really quite few by this stage, and that it's more effective for climate action to actually ignore them completely because they are probably not going to be persuaded into caring. But what's more important, or what's more urgent, is to sort of take care of the people who are quite aware that climate change is happening, but they feel overwhelmed, they feel helpless, they feel a kind of marasmus, yes? They feel that, there's nothing we can do, the only thing that comes to our mind is the apocalypse. So this is, I think, also another really important area where arts can help, just to help people overcome depression, to help people overcome the sense of helplessness, to overcome, the lack of imagination, the lack of vision of a future that would be different than apocalyptic. So all these various ways, I think, in which art can be helpful here. And then I think, I mean, the crucial thing is to make this conversation sort of mainstream enough so that at some point the soap opera, or whatever, this really popular, it will only come as a natural consequence that this conversation will also enter these really super popular media.
I just wanted to say I of course I agree with you, Julia, that and it is entirely good to be talking about this in a tutorial group or in a lecture or in a university. This is very important. I'm just saying let's remember the broad picture. But I would say that you have talked many times about starting the conversation, and that's another thing that I think that the arts can contribute, which is very, very important. It is about enabling a conversation which then happens between people. And if the arts can initiate that conversation, that is very powerful, because actually, again, going back, as it were, to the psychology, we know that the way that people's attitudes form are usually through interactions with the people around them. And you look and you see that is important to that person there, that person there, that person there. These are the people around you, and therefore it starts to become important to you. That's how you would make it salient, is the word psychologists would use. And that social salience is so important. So it's got to be fed into people in a way. So again, I think it's a challenge for the arts of not just how to reach people, but also how to initiate a conversation which lasts outside the art itself. So it's not just like a kind of, you don't just consume something and then walk away, but it's something that triggers you to speak and to talk wider. And I would say, I think that we've seen very big social changes certainly over my lifetime, certainly around attitudes to gender, to race, to sexuality. A key factor in those changes has been the conversations which has happened between friends and family and people at work. That is so important. Or let's say smoking. The thing that's now made it not acceptable for people to smoke, and what we're seeing smoking rates decline, is that it's now not socially acceptable. And there's been a whole series of these billions of these little conversations, and that's where change happens.
Piotr, yes.
I would like to refer to one of the most important parts of the lecture by Grzegorz Czemiel, and Julia also mentioned this. I mean, building of a vision of the world as a whole. Grzegorz Czemiel talked about a model of the earth that engages our imagination. We need a vision that can lead to a model that guarantees a workable and sustainable way of life. Grzegorz talked a lot about world building. He mentions that this world building is composed of two parts, science and storytelling. And as Julia said, we need a vision. We live in dark times. A lot of people fall into a climate depression now. When we think about climate crisis, we think about the apocalypse. I myself may say that I'm also put a lot of effort into not giving up now. The prospects are dark, and mankind's future is bound to be dark, not bright. So especially we need a vision of a better future. And this is a role for, not for science, science gives solution, but art, literature can give this imagination of a better future. Professor Marek Osiewicz, which I already mentioned, he uses the term planetarianism. I like this very much. Planetarianism means planetarianism describe a vision of a real better tomorrow for the whole world, which can be expressed primarily in stories. Creating such a vision is a major challenge for today's culture, as Marek Osiewicz said. Marek Osiewicz says, I'm deeply convinced, I quote now, I'm deeply convinced that the struggle for a vision of the future for us and the earth is not a technological, political, or economic problem, at least not in the first place. First of all, it is a matter of imagination. We need to be able to envision a future based on hope. I believe, Julia, that you like this because you many times mentioned that the ecological crisis is the crisis of our imagination. I recently have a great pleasure to practice this kind of building a vision of a better world with the youth during the youth climate strike on November this year in Katowice. And I invited young people to imagine the world 2050, the world we must create. I was invoking one of the vision of the optimistic changes that had taken place in the world 2050. And after each of them, I asked them for the applause. The greater the applause, the more desire one dream was by majority. I consider important in this way. In this way, I would like to show young people that the world we must build is optimistic, is really nice, it's really fantastic. I would like to present them in what is the beautiful task before them, and what a beautiful time to live now in these dark times, but it's really beautiful. Douglas Bowman, writer, said, I quote, "What a wonderful time to live. Humanity is rediscovering its sources in its consciousness, the nature of life, the world, the universe, God. We stand on the threshold of new time for Earth, because we are faced today with the possibility of taking a new evolutionary step. We are faced with the challenge of entering a new life with a new way of thinking. And the experience of this kind of world building with teenagers, with youth in Katowice, for me was really great. And I think we really need to present, especially young people, the optimistic, beautiful vision of the world, because this world which adults build are awful, but before them is really a beautiful time. So what a wonderful time to live now.
Since you mentioned my name, I will allow myself to respond. It's wonderful what you're saying. I also think that yeah, I do think that this positive vision is needed. However, I also think that the gravity of the situation, the gravity of the situation right now needs to be acknowledged, and the fact that very profound structural changes, like in basically every realm of human life, every system, right, economy, the way we get our food, the way we everything needs to be transformed. So for me, the first step is to address the gravity of the situation, right, and to even allow ourselves this moment of maybe not depression, but this moment of grief, as someone put it beautifully here in the chat, because this grief is very real, and I think part of the reason why this conversation is so difficult to have about climate change is because we repress the grief. That is a very real experience. However, starting from this moment of acknowledging how grave the situation is, and from going through this grief, I do believe that it's crucial to create these vision of alternative futures, alternative to the apocalypse. Because this crisis of the imagination that we keep, these are not my words, it's a quote from Lawrence Buell, but we keep repeating this, and I think primarily what this means is that people think either, people are so attached to our way of life right now. It feels so inevitable. It feels so naturalized, the way we live, the way we use the planet. I mean, I say we, of course, the we is problematic because not everybody is using the planet in the same way. But let's say, we are here, all of us relatively privileged because we're Europeans. So we are the we actually who use the planet. And so it just feels so, it's been so naturalized. It's like, it feels like nature, our ways of engaging with the earth. And so when people think, oh, so either we have to lose all this or climate will change, like the first reaction is okay, so there's nothing, no, but this will not, like, we can't, a change, such a profound change is not going to happen. It's not realistic, which means, okay, the world is going to end. Because the world is going to end, we can just as well live our lives as if nothing was happening. So I think this is where I see this crisis of the imagination, this lack of alternative to the status quo. And of course, the status quo we know is unsustainable. It's incompatible with the laws of physics. This idea of endless progress is incompatible with the laws of physics on this planet, as we know, right? So to create this beautiful vision, as you say, the fact that these new ways of engaging with the earth, that they can be full of joy, and that even this moment can be full of joy when we form communities of support, when we start all kinds of activist actions, that these moments can also be full of joy. I think I agree with you that it's very, very important. And part of the reason why we have organized the School of Ecopoetics is because we wanted more joy, in our work. And we have found more joy in friendship, in, you know, in building a network, in, you know, in meeting with you guys even today. Like all this, working together, building this collective sense of agency is psychologically, I think, very important. And once again, maybe it's happening on a small scale, but when thousands of such initiatives are happening on a small scale, I just really think it's important to keep sort of adding energy to this good conversation, yes, inventing this alternative future without repressing the gravity of the situation, you know, how serious it already is, and that there probably is going to be suffering also in the future.
Thank you, Julia. And I think, yes, this idea of joy, not necessarily because of something, but in spite of something. Joy as, you know, resistance, right? I'll put my own question on the back burner because we do have a question from the audience that might relate a little bit to something that emerged out of your discussions here. To me, also the question of language, how climate change, you know, we talk climate change normally, not climate disaster / catastrophe, right? We talk global warming, that's now maybe less used than climate change, but still, like, warming does not sound like anything bad, really. And so, in other words, although I'm worried to put it in those terms, but the question of very much, in quotes, marketing of climate change, how we talk about it in general. And the question that we have from the audience is related. Mateusz Galica says, businesses also use art in their attempts to attract consumers. Advertising is about stories, music, copywriting, and they have a lot of media. Do you have an idea how to connect not only art and science, but also marketers? I assume that in the process of communicating climate change to a broader audience. I wonder if you think that there is more potential or more threat.
I can speak to that because my own organization, Climate Outreach, this is we are specialists in public communication and engagement. So of course we work with people across the communications world, and I'd say yes and no. There are ways that people in marketing design and develop and test communications which are very valuable for us. In particular, there is a methodology of research, identifying different groups within society, so segmenting society and saying, pardon me, where are the different attitudinal groups, where are the values groups, and how do we speak to them in ways which are part of their experience and part of their values. And that's very important because that goes back to the point I was saying before, that if we're trying to reach people, we have to do it well. So I think that is valuable. I think, however, there are weaknesses with that. Part of the weakness of the business model of the advertising model is that it's often very one way. It's about saying, here is the message, we want you to have this. And often it's actually about making people feel bad about things, saying, you know, you need to have this information or you need to have this. And really what we need, as I said, is much more of a conversation which is between people. But of course, and that really is the real weakness of commercial marketing, is that it's about selling things and it's about selling a product. And that if you're selling a product, like supposing like my phone, it doesn't matter if half of people hate it, because if the other half like it and buy it, that is a huge commercial success. So advertising is not concerned with creating the damage that comes from mis-selling something if it manages to get the sales. And this has had a very bad effect on climate change communications, because a lot of climate communications is asking, how do we reach people and how do we move them? But is not asking, hang on, are there people who are actively alienated by this message who are going to move in the other direction? A big concern for my organization has been that, as I've said before, is that a lot of climate change communications carry a politically progressive left-wing value set, and that people who do not share those values move in the other direction. And we're not talking here, Julia, about climate deniers. I'm talking about people who are a little unsure, a little skeptical. They're not there. The number of people who think climate change is not happening is very few, you're right. But the number of people who think it's been exaggerated, that it's in the future, that there are other things that are more important now, there's a lot of people in that group. And actually, that's a more dangerous group, because that is the group which in the end is going to block climate policy. So the lesson maybe is to say, this is a product that somehow we have to find a way of selling to everybody. And as I said, I think it's a different way of talking, and it's a different way, it's more open conversation. Oh, I will also add that in my own work, something I've seen so many times is that governments, governments have a commitment, by the way, to engage citizens with climate change. They have a legal commitment. The Paris Agreement had a whole article on this. The original Framework Convention had Article 6, which was completely on this. So governments have a legal commitment. And that means whatever we're doing, if we're working in activism or if we're working in the arts, we should be saying, governments, you pay for this. Like, this costs money. If you want things to happen, put some money into it. But what governments typically do is they do nothing, actually. Most governments put no money into this. But when they do, they go, well, let's just bring in an advertising agency. And that is almost always a mess, a disaster. Because the advertising agency will do some like clever little language, and they'll do some little images, and they'll put it out, and then they'll forget about it. Whereas actually what we need is something that is less clever and sustained and goes on and on and on. Right. That's a lot. Sorry, yeah, I'll stop.
Thank you, George. Would anyone, either of you, would like to engage with this?
I'm just, yeah, I just sorry, it's maybe just a random thought, but in the context of what George said, and the people who are against transformation, even though they don't deny climate change, maybe here, because we keep thinking lately, we keep saying that how we shouldn't how people shouldn't be scared, because scaring people is not helpful, and how it's so hard to imagine climate change because it's so vast. But on the other hand, it becomes easier and easier to imagine climate change because it's becoming, because the symptoms are so drastic. Yes, already recent summers and various natural catastrophes that have been happening, and weather extremes that have been happening all over the planet. From what I know, the scientific community is changing the way in which these individual weather events are attributed to climate change. Because not long ago, it was impossible to say that this particular hurricane is caused by climate change, because you always needed to say, yes, in principle, climate change is going to increase the number of hurricanes. However, in this particular case, we cannot say that it was caused by climate change. I think this is going to change now, that this method of attribution or the way in which this attribution is articulated is going to change, so that it is actually possible to say that according to all likelihood, this was caused by climate change. So I mean, to somehow getting this across, it's a difficult task to get across the gravity of the situation, without making people paralyzed. But I do think, and I here I am actually repeating what Magdalena Budziszewska is saying, one of our teachers at the School of Ecopoetics, who is a psychologist at Warsaw University. She says, she emphasizes this sort of more serious aspect, or more even depressing aspect of climate change, that we do need to articulate how serious it is, so that it does get across, you know, that it's actually, it is an existential threat to civilization. Yes, because this does not register, I don't think, yes, that it is actually, it does pose an existential threat to our civilization. And in this context, worrying about how much it's going to cost, for instance, it's or like how much mitigation is going to cost, is kind of really, you know, ridiculous, because the other alternative is the non-existence of the civilization, maybe, yes, or so. So sorry, I have nothing ready to say. I just thought, in response to what George was saying, that maybe we have recently underscored optimism maybe a bit too much. I don't know, and this also somehow. But how to communicate this? I don't know. I don't think you can have advertising for, you know, I don't think either advertising could work. You know, I can think about sort of like really mainstream promotion of these alternative visions of the future that could perhaps become fashionable, that could perhaps become hip, returning to what George earlier said about, you know, very popular culture promoting ecological attitudes. Although the problem with popular culture is also that it's very commercial, so it usually also, you know, sells something. So I don't know, sorry, but maybe it didn't make any sense what I tried to say, but
I had a quick return if I could, but is that okay, Peter?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I just want to say this question about how we communicate, how the existential threat. It's the research for a long time was saying you can't tell people bad, you know, depressing messaging, you know, and that's wrong, I think. But I think you have to do it in a way that validates and supports their sense of identity. So a lot of what we know about communications is that people have an identity that is something that makes them proud. We have to find a way of speaking to that in a way that reinforces their identity. And so the messaging, we've tested messaging all around the world, and it's interesting that one of the things we test, which comes through again and again, is a comparison between saying there are many easy things we can do on this, we can come together, we can deal with this problem, like kind of a positive message, or a more challenging message. And the more challenging message is the one which always works best with any audience, left wing, right wing. We've tested this in India, across North Africa, Canada. And the message is to say, this will be hard. This is going to be really hard, but we can do it because we've faced problems before. We've faced, and in every culture, people have faced problems. And I'm speaking to you guys from Poland. Crikey, you have had such a hard history. But you can say, we have faced those problems. We have come through proud, strong. We have come through. We are independent. We are moving forwards. And this is another problem, but we've shown that we can do it. So it's a way of, it's not a positive message. It's making people feel positive about their identity in the context of something that is challenging. And of course, the beauty of this kind of message is it speaks well across the political barriers as well, because it's about a sense of national identity that is not the same as nationalism. It's a kind of community cultural pride, not we are better than you, but of saying, yeah, of saying we can do this.
And this is, I promise, is the last thing I'm saying, because the same goes for groups of people such as coal miners, for instance, yes, or groups of people whose livelihood and whose family traditions have been closely linked with extraction economies.
Absolutely.
You know, that their pride in also needs to be respected, yes, and that their sense of identity also needs to be respected. And
thank you for asking about that. And I went to Katowice for the COP conference. I met the former head of a Polish coal miners trades union. My own family are coal miners for 4 generations, up to my grandfather. And I feel very strongly that we need to respect and recognize and the contribution that fossil fuels have made. And we need to say to people, this is not going to be easy, but we're going to support you and help you with this transition. There is still a lot of contributions that you can make. In Alberta, we did a big program in Alberta in Canada where everybody is invested in the oil industry, either themselves or their friends or their families. And the language which works there starts by saying, thank you. Thank you for the work and the contribution you have made to our country and our prosperity. We now know that we need to move towards new resources, but we are a resource economy, and your skill can help to carry us through to these new resources. This is not going to be easy. This is going to be difficult. This is going to be challenging when we face these problems before. It's that message. But you're absolutely right, Julie. We have to start by recognizing and respecting these communities. And my colleagues in the environmental movement, as you heard from Marta, I've worked all of my life. I've worked for Greenpeace, for many grassroots organizations. We fundamentally disrespect some of these people who we need to be working with.
Yes. Piotr.
George, I'm not. I agree with you totally, but I'm not going to talk about the Polish situation because it's sad for me. Situation in Poland and the way of thinking of miners and other people. I think that there is a possible scenario that we as a humanity will behave like people on the Titanic. Yeah, they know everything. They see that they sank, but they do the same, and the same could be with us. The only solution for me is to change our way of thinking, total change of our way of thinking about ourselves and the nature, our planet. So, in my opinion, there's the main task for science and the main task for poetry is to question or undermine anthropocentrism. It's the fundamental for me. If we will not change the way of thinking of people, if we will not challenging anthropocentrism, there's no future for us. But science, for example, ecology, as a part of biology, in terms of ecological research, the work of nature, our work is biocentric. So in science, we have a great help to show people, to convince them that the world in reality is biocentric. So, in my opinion, our task is to present this opinion to the audience. It's very difficult task, yeah, I agree, but we have science, scientific evidences that the world is biocentric, and we have a lot of fantastic people in humanities, in art. So the only way is to use these tools, science and art, and convince people that their way of thinking about life, about themselves, is simply wrong, because the world, nature is even, is biocentric.
And so when I yeah, you know, when I mentioned earlier that I think we need a revolution in education towards transdisciplinarity, I think part of what I think is important is that, for example, the humanities students or the students of literature also learn some fundamental science, you know, because I also think that the kind of very narrow specialization that we have at universities nowadays is perhaps a bit of a problem, that people really know very little. Even, you know, everybody knows about climate change, but people really know very little about how it works. And understanding a little bit about how it works, I think, helps to make it more real. I think brings it home. or at least that's how it worked for me. You know, the moment I learned a little bit about the physics of atmosphere, that became more real. So so I mean, just responding to what you said about, once again, about combining these ways of knowing, or articulating, finding ways to articulate in language on many levels what science teaches us, I think is very crucial. And for this reason, I think it's also very crucial that we as humanities scholars turn to science, because humanities, I speak as a humanities scholar and as a writer myself. And I know, we have sometimes had tendencies to turn to the sciences, but use the scientific theories as metaphors, in ways which are very often, which are not always very precise. And so I think respecting science as our most reliable source of knowledge is crucial, right? That's another crisis that we're facing, that people stopped trusting science. Because that's also how social media work, that you can have scientific consensus on one side, and then on the other side someone has an opinion, and these are presented as two equivalent sort of ways of thinking. Yes, so these are very fundamental things which I think have to change in education, that people have to be taught what is proper knowledge, what is the knowledge that can be trusted, and what is not. Yes, and then and I think my own experience as a teacher, when I introduce, for example, in my poetry classes, when we sometimes read poems that demand a little bit of botany, the students love it. They really enjoy it. They really enjoy learning a little bit about, because people don't even know the names of trees in their city. And so, so once again, it's a small intervention, but I'm just hoping that it's going to grow, and I do think that education is important. Of course, it happens slowly, but unless the world ends pretty soon, this process of transformation is going to take a long time. So we need both, I guess, short-term interventions and long-term interventions through art and education to change people's way of thinking.
Thank you. Would anybody like to engage George or Piotr what Julia was saying? Okay, we have less than 10 minutes, or about 10 minutes for our discussion. So I would just maybe briefly ask a wrap-up question and ask you for brief kind of wrap-up answers through a perspective that I think emerged out of what you all have been pointing to as one of the both challenges and avenues for change, and something that Grzegorz is briefly mentioning in his talk. It's the institutional role, because Julia keeps underscoring the role of education, which of course is crucial, but apart from education, spirituality, Piotr, I think you mentioned it twice in lectures that you were delivering, and I don't want to narrow down education to schools and spirituality to churches, because this is a very limited vision, but the role of those institutions in those two realms is significant. And those are also two institutions that will reach, that person that George was talking about, the white working class rural man in his 60s, right? Well, maybe not school anymore, but through his grandchildren. So briefly, and I will be interrupting you if need be. Any comments on this kind of institutional role and hope, if those institutions can help merging and synergizing art, sciences, humanities?
We're very polite, aren't we? Maybe then if I will start. Yes, I think I think institutions and networks. I think if we go back to the question I said, which is how do we reach widely? How do we reach across society? How do we build this? How do we build this this broad mandate for action? Then institutions are very important. Education is important because there's so many levels for education, and you're quite right there, Marta, to say, you know, the influence is not just on the people who are in the education; it's on the people around them. It's the effect of children's on their families, and it reaches much wider. Then there's other forms of education that are even less formal. I think museums are a form of education. I think museums are interesting because I think they're in exactly this crossover space between science and arts. The presentation of information in a museum is often very artistic, and many of the people who work in that have an arts background. And I've worked with many museums on the development of climate change content, and I think that's very valuable. I'd say that institutions broadly, yeah, I mean, spiritual is not just for church, but let's just talk about churches. The possibility to reach people through faith is very important. And I've worked with, I've run programs for some years across the main faiths, and I think the ones which most interest me actually are the Muslims and the Hindus. Hinduism has a very strong spirit of keeping of the world as the world being in balance. Balance is a core concept, and how actually humanity has knocked the world out of balance. It's very interesting to me doing research work in India that Indians automatically accept the idea that it may be us through our actions and our pollution that's changing the world's weather patterns. There isn't any. They don't even need the science. That's just built into the culture. Muslims are very interesting because within Islam, there's a very strong sense of not taking too much, of moderation. Again, this idea of balance is very strong in Islam. So I think there's so much powerful in there. And I'd say if we're talking about institutions, let's also talk about the workplace. The workplace is a very important, you know, people spend most of their lives actually you know, at work. Many people spend more time with their work colleagues than they do with their family. There's a lot that can happen here, both from the employers helping to build a culture and awareness of climate change inside the organization, but also with trades unions and with people who actually work directly with workers in the workplace. And let's remember also that the workplace also is not just what happens there, but they buy from people. They have a supply line that they can be talking with, and they sell to people. They have a customer base. My organization at the moment is working with IKEA, as you can imagine, a more progressive organization, at exactly this way of saying, how can we train members of staff to have conversations with each other and with the wider public as part of their work about climate change. And so you see, and again, going back, I guess, to the point about the arts, I think all of this is very creative. I don't have a dividing line between arts and science and communications. I think there's a lot of crossover there, but we need creative ideas about language to come from the arts, but we can include the arts into the way that we present things, and that we can yeah.
Thank you for this. School, churches, workplace also. Yulia, Piotr, do you have any quick additions that you would like to share? We have a couple more minutes.
Just want to say just one thing, because the institutional problem that Grzegorz knows, and I know because we both work as academics, is that the academy is, of course, you know, it's a huge, like, university is a huge institution, yes, and it has departments and everything, and this transdisciplinary work is not always easy, and also one problem that can be diagnosed is the problem that in this neoliberal sort of system of values, humanities are made to conform to a certain system where we have to show up for, you know, what we've done in ways which are, I think, incompatible with the best practices in our discipline. So I do see an institutional problem, for example, in how humanities function at the university right now. So, like, one thing is the institutional obstacle to interdisciplinarity, and the other is institutional obstacles to the freedom of the humanities, because we're asked to deliver deliverables. Yes, and that's everybody who works in the academy knows that this is a problem. So, but I don't know how to solve it. I mean, and we're nearing the end of this panel, so
yes, we are running out of time. So, Piotr, if you could just one sentence, couple of sentences, please
okay.
go ahead.
What is the institutional role of university, for example? I can say, tell the truth. 1 year later, it was fantastic article by 17 famous ecologists, and they say that we people, politicians, but also we need cold shower. The rector of my university said that we people, academics, we need cognitive shock. So we must tell the truth about the world. And the truth is only one. We live in a planetary crisis. As regards nature, a clue for us to exist means to coexist. We cannot exist with other species. Exist means coexist with others. Tell the truth.
Thank you, Piotr. I think, yes, exist is coexist, right? And this is the shift in the imagination that we need. I would like to thank you all for participating in this panel. George said to begin with thank you, which is going to be my takeaway from this one. To begin a conversation with thank you. That's so powerful. And let me all close this conversation with thank you to the panelists, to Grzegorz for delivering the lecture, and to everyone who has tuned in to listen to this conversation. I invite you to watch the panel that's going to follow in less than 10 minutes from this one. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
All right, greetings everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the second part of the online conference, Changing the Story, Climate Crisis as a Crisis of Imagination, organized by Climate-KIC and the School of Ecopoetics. My name is Grzegorz Czemiel. I'm assistant professor at the Maria Curie Skłodowska University in Lublin, and I have the privilege of hosting this panel, which is titled How to Build, Communicate, and Teach Ecological Intelligence. Now, you can share the stream, which I strongly encourage, because we have some truly fabulous guests this afternoon, whom I would like to introduce now in alphabetical order. So first, we have Alexandra Godis, who is an education design developer at Climate-KIC, as well as a sociologist at the University of Warsaw in the Social Challenges Unit. Moreover, she's an activist and facilitator of community-based projects. Welcome to the panel.
Super, thank you.
We also have Eva Meyer, who is an artist, writer, philosopher, and singer-songwriter. She has written 11 books and has been translated into 18 languages. In her work, she engages a large variety of media, performance art, music theater, installation, video, drawing, and photography. Welcome.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Zoe Scolding, who is an award-winning poet and literary critic who works in fields such as translation, study, and sound, and ecology. She is professor of poetry and creative writing at Bangor University in Wales, and has published a number of collections of poetry, most recently Footnotes to Water, as well as The Celestial Setup and A Revolutionary Calendar. Now, thank you all so much for kindly accepting the invitation and joining us today. Now, I have arranged that we have a bunch of questions ready for you, but of course we will be also able to take some questions from the audience, right? So I hope you'll be ready for that. But first of all, I would like to say that, of course, our point of departure for today is the lecture on ecological intelligence delivered by Professor Julia Fiedorczuk. And the subject has been making waves in circles where ecology is taken seriously as the primary challenge for our times. Julia Fiedorczuk argues in her talk that ecological intelligence crucially involves weaving scientific and artistic findings together in order to attune us better to the natural environment. We should be taking advantage of the unique strengths of art and science, she says, to reinforce dialogue rather than fuel old antagonisms such as the famed science wars. She also claims that poetic intuitions about interconnectedness and entanglements in the ecosphere cannot be dismissed as merely aesthetic exercises, but carry the potential to refocus our various cognitive efforts on the larger world. Noticing the world, as she puts it, is the basis of the ethics of care and engagement. Further, she goes on, poetry constitutes a specific laboratory of the imagination, where new metaphors are forged with the aim of developing an ecological sense of interconnectedness, or, as she terms it, ecological intelligence. So we, the earthlings, as she calls us in the lecture, need this competence very much. First, to develop new ways of thinking, and second, to form more ethical and sustainable relationships in the Anthropocene. Now, in this first round of questions, I'd like to throw a little bit more light on the concept, asking our panelists to share with us how they understand ecological intelligence from the perspective of their work. So first off, I would like to ask Alexandra Godis, what would be a sociologist's perspective on ecological intelligence? Is ecological imagination a question of thinking in terms of systems, emotions, or both? How is sociology engaging these topics today, and does it have room for such issues within its contemporary paradigms?
If it's okay, I will be talking from the perspective of my organization because it's very practical, and I prefer to not be theoretist here. So what I deadly need when I'm thinking about ecological intelligence, I need several elements or several notions or modules. One is community and this perspective of common, which is very missing, especially in politics and policy dimension. So we are trying in EIT Climate-KIC, we are trying to build community as something very genuine, because it's very obvious to talk about, it's easy to talk about community, which is only a slogan, but to really experience community is very hard. So for me, the first element of this ecological intelligence is this community, not only between humans being, of course, we have to feel community with other beings and with planet itself. The second element is connected with special approach to knowledge, which shouldn't be solid and in stone. It should be like a process. So in our projects, we are trying to think about knowledge as a knowing rather. And I remember from Julia Fiedorczuk lecture that she was also using this term knowing, which is more like a process and motion. So in our documents, we are talking about
closing loops of intelligence gathering. And I think that this is very important, that people not only know something or they want to know something, but they are trying to develop their knowing constantly as a process. And third will be very about experience. It also sounds a little bit obvious, but we are trying in our projects to really make people not only read about what is the system we want to change, but also to like feel that. So that's why we spend a lot of time, not in only classical research, which is very dividing people between the researcher and the object, we can say, but we spend a lot of time in deep listening process. So we were trying to build the whole narratives of different type of people from the systems. In my example, system is a city or a region in which we are undertaking our processes. So that will be the third element. So first is community and common. The second is knowing and learning loops, we can say. And third is experience on something very material. It's not a good word, something which you really can feel, not only think about. Very last thing, it also sounds like a slogan, and sorry for that, but in ecological intelligence is also about long-term thinking and feeling. So what is missing very often is that we have this tendency to think about present. And I deeply believe that one of the crucial elements of this intelligence is really trying to look in a very long perspective and also feel responsible for this long-term perspective. So that will be the the fourth element from my list. Thank you.
Right. Thanks so much for this. I was only thinking about where does thinking in terms of systems fit in your breakdown of the essential components here. Certainly, thinking in terms of systems is not something that we are capable of through direct experience, can we? Right? Because it feels to me that it goes beyond our direct experience. So where would you place it in this little map that you've just drawn?
You are so right. Sorry that I'm interrupting you, but I even remember the quotation from one of our stakeholders, like the person who is taking part in our process, and this person told me, "I don't know any system. I only know people." And this is so right. So this is the drama I'm experiencing on a daily basis, because the old documents I'm promoting when I'm working for my organization is like repeating this system thinking as a pillar of what we are trying to do. And then we are doing concrete processes in the place, in the city or in the region, and there is no system. So I'm treating system only as a tool which make our deeper understanding of complexity of reality a little bit easier. So for me, system is only like a term which make us more capable of grasp complexity of reality. So I'm using this as in a very technical way. I don't think that we should think about system as something powerful, because only we are powerful, not systems.
Right, that is a very interesting observation, a fascinating angle to think about systems. So thank you so much for this. Now, to look at the problem from yet another perspective, I would like to turn to Eva Meyer and ask you about your experience and expertise in the field of animal rights and animal studies. Now, I was wondering what we can learn from animals in terms of developing human ecological intelligence, or perhaps I should say more than human ecological intelligence. So can animals help us grasp some aspects of ecological intelligence? What would be your perspective on this?
Yes, thank you very much, Gregor, and also Alexandra. I will return to. I really liked your answer, so I will also return to the points that you raised. But first of all, about this question, what can we learn from the other animals about ecological intelligence? I think that one of the great challenges of our time in the face of all the ecological problems that we are encountering is that we should decenter the human. So very often there's this opposition between the human on the one hand and then nature on the other hand, or the human on the one hand and animals on the other hand. In order to address ecological problems, we need to understand that we are part of all of these entanglements with other animals in many ways. And when we turn to the concept of ecological intelligence, well, the first thing is that as humans, we are not the only intelligent beings. I wrote a lot about animal languages, and language is very often seen as this specific human capacity, but it turns out that other animals also speak. They also have ways of creating meaning, either vocally or through color patterns on their skin or with scents and all of these things. And learning to listen to the other animals can help us develop another attitude that is not simply focused on the human, because humans have been obsessed with humans for a very long time. And I think that one of the threats in thinking about climate problems is that it's still about kind of the survival of our species and this sort of idea of, well, if we tune into nature, then nature will help us survive or something. But what also came up in the talk that Julia Fedorchuk gave was that there are actual problems with appropriating knowledge of others. And she discussed this in the case of human communities, of human indigenous communities. And I would be a bit careful. I mean, we're using animals for many, many, many things, often in very violent ways. And I think that the insights from decolonial theory should also help us navigate the question of listening to animals and not sort of taking their knowledge from them and then using it for our own survival, but actually becoming attuned in new ways. So when it comes to ecological intelligence, many non-human animals have different ways of navigating the world that we are already connected to, right? So in the case of domesticated animals, there's a lot of interspecies communication. There are also many ways in which humans and other animals already live together in sustainable ways, and that can help us think of new ways of existing with other animals. And all of these questions are also deeply political. So very often we think of animals as kind of outside of the political paradigm or outside of political communities. But already the question of language, who gets to speak, who gets to speak in poetry, but also who gets to speak democratically. These are all political questions. So to sort of give a guideline, I think that our task as humans is to develop a new kind of attitude, to be very aware of the different kinds of violence that we enact upon other beings, but also open to their worlds, the worlds that we share with them. And I think this idea of an ethics of care that Julia Fedorchuk spoke about can guide us, but also the general idea of poetry, being open to new forms of language, to new forms of meaning creation. All of these things can play a role in navigating the world differently through looking at other animals. And I also think that the things that Alexandra discussed, so building community, thinking about knowledge as a process and not as a kind of capacity or something that we have, a thing, and starting from experience. I think these three guidelines actually can also help us refigure relationships with other animals. And ultimately, it's not a task for the humans alone, right? How do we extract knowledge from other animals and take it from there? No, it's really about entering a respectful dialogue, building new communities, forming new forms of knowledge in a multi-species way. And this can kind of help us overcome this obsession with the human that we need to overcome in order to build a better world for everybody.
Thanks so much for this. I'm really glad that you mentioned this idea of poetry as exhibiting a certain kind of hospitality or a certain kind of capacity for holding or inviting diverse languages. And this is precisely what I wanted to ask about, what I wanted to ask Zoe Scolding about, because I was thinking about this question of whether literature can augment our ecological intelligence, can it enhance it, and perhaps whether poetry is somehow uniquely predisposed to provide space for dialogue with science and space for those other voices.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. And yeah, and I've also really enjoyed those last two answers. Yeah, a lot I'd agree with there. And thinking back to Julia's talk and her point about poetry as really demonstrating the inseparability of matter and meaning. So that when we think of a poem, it's language, it's sound, it might have a visual form, and all of those are working together. It's a material thing that's been created. So so I think sometimes when people consider the question of communicating environmental issues, they think of sort of communicating language as a channel of communication. And it is true that poetry can also help to generate new metaphors. It can help to find a language for things that we want to talk about and be a kind of laboratory for developing that. But also it does something else, because it also often resists straightforward modes of communication to do something with sound, or to do something that is more complex, and that we might enjoy in a more physical, more embodied way. And so it's in language, but it's also doing something that is often a little bit different from other forms of language. And I think because of this, because it has this particularly important kind of sounded element, it can be a form that helps us to engage with different kinds of listening. So yeah, really interested that Eva mentioned listening is particularly important. And of course there are different kinds of listening, and sometimes we listen to something and grasp it straight away. Sometimes we listen to something and we're kind of intrigued by it, and often that's the case with listening to animals or things in the world, and it can also be the case with poetry. And I think that kind of listening, that kind of stretches us out towards what we don't perhaps fully know, is really one of the values, particularly of poetry. And the Canadian poet Stephen Collis, in fact, says, "I think sometimes poetry is not made of language. It's some strange silence or grave emptiness or dark material that stands in the place of language, mimicking language, fooling or confusing us, but having other intents, a different destination." And so that idea that it's opening up something different means that it puts us in a place for perhaps appreciating other kinds of phenomena or awareness at the same time as thinking about these forms of language. And I think it's true that as we think about ecological crisis, we want to turn our attention to the non-human, more than human world, but also we want to avoid perhaps representing other species in ways that sort of appropriate them, or perhaps that don't acknowledge our connectedness to them. So we're always thinking about relationship. And so poetry especially is this medium that's materially entangled with language, but it's always thinking about these kind of outer limits of encounter, or often, perhaps sometimes not, but the poetry that particularly interests me is doing that. And so Yulia was talking about Karan Barad, the physicist who talks about matter and meaning, ontology and epistemology as being connected, and her idea, it comes from this idea that the behavior of matter really changes according to the way that it's observed. So the activity of observation can't be separated from phenomena. And so if we think about poetry that is addressing or is addressed by the non-human world, we can really think about how we're connected, and poetry is a kind of interesting medium for doing this, and has been for a long time. And perhaps thinking also of what Ava's saying about sort of the listening to other creatures. If we think about, for example, Shelley, the romantic poet Shelley, he talks about he addresses the skylark, is inspired by the skylark song to write an ode to it, and so he kind of hopes that he can learn from this bird in order to communicate something to the world, and he says, it's got the harmonious madness of its song, and what he wants is for he says the world should listen then as I am listening now. So he wants to kind of bring the world to his feet, all listening to his kind of wonderful voice as a poet, but he's kind of standing outside the world, and is also seeing the bird as this kind of messenger of the spirit world, who is also outside of the world in some sense, and so he sees his role as poet as being sort of perhaps talking to the material world from some other space, and I think there might be other ways of kind of looking at what that relationship is, and especially thinking back to Karan Barad, because she's talking about the world as this performance of active elements that are always connecting with each other. And so if we thought of poetry as really being this entanglement of matter and meaning, we could perhaps think of a different kind of example. So another kind of bird-human collaboration I'd like to just suggest as an example is the UK poet Emma Bennett. And she does these wonderful performances where she listens to birdsong on headphones and then improvises human language in the same patterns. And it's really funny and beautiful work. And I think it's also interesting in the way that the poet then kind of becomes a mimic, sort of pushing human language into something that's actually shaped by a bird-like process. And so sometimes people think of science as a kind of repetitive or experimental process, and poetry as self-expression. But I would say this is an example of poetry that actually uses a sort of observational process or a listening process to make something that's really extraordinary and surprising, that is somehow collaboratively formed. And so if we think about poetry as a kind of performative process of encountering the world, it opens up all of these possibilities. And so Yulia was talking especially about documentary poetry that engages with particular kinds of knowledge or information. Or it might use a process of observation, as in the examples I've given, but it activates language relationships in a performative way. and so it can make new relationships, new knowledge. And I think poetry does draw us into communities. I mean, certainly there are communities of poets, but it also helps us to think about how we might extend those forms of community to the more than human world.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this contribution. So what emerges from your answers, I'd say, is something that we could capture in a rather tentative definition of perhaps ecological intelligence, consisting in a rebalancing of listening and expression, so as to bring forth the possibility of new kinds of communities, and of course new kinds of knowledge within those communities. So I feel that has been a very, very informative. Thank you so much. I would like to gradually move to the second round of questions and ask you about different ways of implementing ecological intelligence, or perhaps developing ecological intelligence. Daniel Goldman, who's written on ecological intelligence, has a very interesting argument. He claims that ecological imagination needs to be taught, and in a very specific way, because evolution has not really equipped us with any kinds of alarm systems, that would be sensitive to changes that occur at such vast scales. This is something that our organisms are not fit to perceive and process, really, right? So we have to teach ourselves to do that in a way. And so it becomes pertinent to ask how we can teach or stimulate the development of ecological intelligence. So a little bit of strategizing now. And I would like also to start now again with Alexandra and ask you, what are the key institutions you think we should focus on while campaigning to boost the development of ecological imagination? What are the crucial nodes, in the systems that surround us, where, what are the strategic places that we should work on?
I believe that no type of organization or institution should be excluded from building capacity in ecological intelligence. There is no time left to really start with schools, then we are going to universities, and then we will work with museums or whatever. Like, everyone has to incorporate the dimension of building ecological intelligence, and this is one of the goals we are trying to achieve in our program. So when we start working with, for example, one city, we would love every single person in this city as a system, sorry for this word, to really think about the future. That is the first thing. Think about like planet, and think about all other stuff which are connected to that. I really love this one sentence from Julia lecture, that poetry is giving concentrated form of attention. Like, we are obsessively thinking in our institution how to really make people able to notice that this problem is happening. Sorry, I'm talking very from the Polish perspective and East Europe perspective. So very often during our processes, someone is telling us, okay, this is a problem, but we can wait. We'll have bigger problems here to solve. And I believe that really testing all these elements or tools which are bringing our attention to that, this is what we should focus right now. And when I was listening to Eva and Zoe, I was so jealous, because like public institution and institution as mine, we are operating with the language which is so not attractive, which is so detached from people. Like, when people start to read our documents, they totally trying to get rid of that after one page. So I truly believe that one of the, trying to answer your question, Grzegorz, first is really to not to think which institutions should be interested in building ecological intelligence, but to really think that every institution should do that. Second is really to incorporate different form of language, because the language which is dominating in policy, especially educational policies or climate policies, we can say. This is this kind of language which is not really drawing attention of anyone. So that is the second thing. And third, sorry, I will be coming back to my first answer, to create conditions that people won't be only thinking about that, but they will be also experiencing that. So we organized several educational experiments last year. And one of these experiments from Italy was to really make people be in a place where there is no water, for example, for several days. And so it's not only like a technical question, like imagine that you have no water in your city, but we are really placing people in a situation that this shortages is experienced by you. And you have to really rethink your life, taking into account that that will happen. So it's not only about alarming people, but it's, I prefer this sentence, drawing attention, or a concentration form of attention to really notice what is happening. And based on that, I believe that people have this natural tendency to try to understand what can we do. And this is the source of innovation. So in my organization, we overuse term innovation, like we deadly need innovation, we need innovation. But we cannot just jump to innovation without these previous steps. And first steps is to notice what is happening. Second is to look for others who want to work or think with you on that. And then is how to recreate the conditions in which we are living to really make the better future happening. Last sentence here. I think that, and that was super visible in both your lecture and Eula's lecture, that every division is super risky and dangerous. And from many complex reasons, there are the powerful structure who really likes to divide our reality. And what I think it's really important in building ecological intelligence is to really think how to connect those divisions. So, for example, first division between theory and practice, like ecological intelligence is not only like intelligence like thinking, it's intelligence in practicing. So I like this term from Michel Foucault, was writing that practices are like a spaces when our thinking and articulation is meeting with our activities. And this is exactly what I'm thinking about ecological intelligence, that we have to create a space where our thoughts and our activities are together jointly. It wasn't very practical answer, sorry for that.
Well, I think that was a wonderful answer, and I'm very much, I would very much agree. And I really like this perspective where practice and theory, especially, which is a especially painful divide experienced in the academia, right? And something that can be, easily, that's something that, academics can be easily accused of, right? Myself included. So I think working with that division is very important now. Thanks so much for this. Now, perhaps moving on, I would like to ask Eva Meyer how we can mobilize various forms of art, such as those you practice yourself, to turn them into vehicles of ecological intelligence. Specifically, I was wondering about this dilemma of anthropocentrism, which you yourself brought up in your previous answer, because anthropocentrism is a difficult problem, because our art, right, and our creativity is essentially anthropocentric. So how can we make it accommodate also other perspectives, so that it becomes more attuned or more in sync with with the ecological intelligence?
Yeah, thank you. And so first of all, I think that it's very important to criticize divisions, like between academia and art and all of these things. And also in the way that we are speaking about it now is meant to kind of bring out something. But I also want to emphasize that within academia, there are many different traditions. So I'm a philosopher. I work at the University of Amsterdam. And then you have like continental philosophy, which is more narrative and critical. There's analytic philosophy, which is more perhaps after the system of the life science and sciences. And so I want to be a bit careful about creating oppositions there as well. And I'm saying this because I think that within different fields, there are different things that you can articulate. One of the reasons why I like doing philosophy, also academic philosophy, is that it has a certain abstraction. So you can be very precise and use words as tools. And one of the reasons why I like writing novels is because you can make a completely different type of argument, which focuses more on the emotion, but also the ambiguities of life. So in philosophy, I can be more argumentative and say, okay, life is like this. And in the novel, I do something else. And then when you play music, then you have another way of communicating with others. And I think that within these language games, there are different types of knowledge that are generated that can solve different aspects of our question. And like Alexandra said, we need work from all directions. So not simply different institutions, but also different forms of language use, different language games. Then to your question, how can we mobilize these and how can we avoid anthropocentrism? I think one of the ways in which we can avoid anthropocentrism we already discussed, and that is by listening, being attentive. I also liked in Julia's talk that she mentioned poetry as a way of learning how to show up in your life. I think that's indeed something that we forget, and that's very specific. That's a very nice and wise way of saying it. And when you are attentive and open up, then you already are other regarding in a sense and overcoming yourself. I also think that our ways of creating meaning now are not solely human. It is already more than human. And that is also the position of many of the theorists that were discussed earlier. We are already entangled with others. So yes, we should do the sort of explicit critique in order to overcome anthropocentrism, but also, tell stories that show that we were already entangled with these others. And one of the things I thought about when Zoe was talking is the work of Pauline Oliveros, who writes about, she was a musician and composer who wrote about deep listening. And deep listening is a way of actually listening, so with your ears. I think that we are now using listening in two ways, either as kind of the metaphor of being attentive, but also as an actual listening practice. And Oliveros developed some, she called it sonic meditation, so ways in which people can become more attuned to their surroundings by actually listening to what's going on. And that has the quality, these meditations or these practices of not only, because we tend to think about the world as kind of static environment, but we also need to learn to listen to the things that we are not sure are there, or to the sort of newness, and that carries a sort of promise in it. So that's kind of the response to what Zoe was saying as well. And perhaps poetry also invites us to listen beyond what we know. So how do we overcome anthropocentrism? By listening, being attentive, drawing on knowledge generated in different language games. I'm a political philosopher, so I think about justice and these kinds of things. This maybe not really has a space in this panel, and maybe it does. But and these are all different lenses through which we can encounter these questions. And one of the final thing I wanted to mention is through actual encounters with others. So I think maybe this is also what Alexandra was hinting at. The spaces we need are sometimes actual spaces in which we engage with actual others. And one of the things I discussed in Dutch politics is that very often politicians tend to decide about lives of many non-human animals. Are we going to kill them or not? Without knowing anything about the animals that they are talking about. They often don't even know what they look like. And actually going outside, meeting them is, I think, the first prerequisite for making any kind of informed decision. So yes, actual encounters with others should also be part of that. But and your question was, how can we mobilize different forms of art? I think that's a very difficult question to ask from someone who makes art, because I don't think art is for anything. You know, it's not instrumental. It actually defies instrumentality. So you can't think about it in that sense. Then you need to turn on a different hat and say, oh, yes, we should teach poems in schools, and we should rewrite governmental reports so that people can read them more easily. So yes, we should do that as well, but I don't really have anything to say about that.
Well, great. I think you've said quite quite enough on this bundle of topics. I'm very glad that you brought up the deep listening dimension of the musical or sonic program of Pauline Oliveros, and I have myself been very much attracted to this, and it seems to me that the fascinating thing about it is that what she tries to do sometimes is to produce within the listeners a kind of awareness, or to kind of guide them towards an awareness of themselves listening, and that ultimately at the end it's not the music that you're listening to, but you're listening to yourself listening, and therefore become more deeply aware of being an embodied creature that lives in this world here, which is full of sounds, right? And that of course stimulates interesting responses to the world and to all kinds of otherness. So thanks so much for that. And political philosophy has its place here. I can reassure you, we'll get there at a later point.
There's one thing I want to add also because of your remark. I think that very often we tend to think of these things as kind of individual practices of transformation, and these have a place, of course, and it's important for yourself. But I also think we need to think about these in a democratic sense. So when you think about deep listening, I also think we should conceive this as kind of a democratic practice, so that we can collectively be more attuned, because that is the big challenge now, is to sort of translate all of these questions to kind of the bigger picture.
Right. Thanks so much for this. I think this has been already very stimulating. Now I would like to turn to Zoe Scolding. And obviously, given what has just been said, I would be remiss if I did not, draw on your own reflections and experiences with sound. After all, you are the author of The Museum of Disappearing Sounds, a fantastic collection that tackles a lot of what we've been looking at now, right? Actually, what I wanted to ask you about was rather about something that Julia has mentioned, the decolonization of our minds, and a kind of capacity within poetry to look toward non-Western, non-mainstream ways of thinking present in indigenous or non-dominant languages, or perhaps even pre-verbal sources, as she suggests. But if you're willing to riff on what we've been talking about with regard to sound, I would also love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, no, I really enjoyed it. And in fact, yeah, I've written a little about Oliveros in a monograph that came out last year called "Poetry and Listening: The Noise of Lyric." And so I was particularly interested in that book in thinking about I suppose the idea of lyric, but also a kind of situated lyric that that when we think about noise in sort of communications theory, it's considered something that shouldn't be there, but you can also think of the effects of poetry, but also the environments of poetry as being also kind of informed by multiplicity, by by forms of kind of resonance, which are in a sense noisy. And to me, it's got something to do with being in places and being also in communities, and thinking about poetry in relation to those. And so absolutely sort of not a kind of silent and direct channel of communication, but something that has a musical history, but also a kind of sounded history of happening in places and communities and between languages. And so it does also connect with the other part of your question, because one of the ways that I'm interested in sound in poetry is the way that one language can kind of accommodate echoes of another. And so is that moving away from ecology? I don't think so, because that idea of kind of being haunted by other sounds when we use language, or the idea that poetry as a material form can have these kind of multiple channels open, to me that's something has something to do with the different relationships that are possible within it, that include, as I was saying earlier, relationships, for example, with birds I was talking about there, but also the way that our language is kind of bouncing off this material world that we're part of. And so you're saying about Oliveros makes us sort of aware of our own bodies as sounding instruments, or if we think about John Cage's awareness of the sounds of his own bodies, you feel your own body as material, and you can then understand its relationships with the world, its effect on the world. You understand those in a different way. And I think poetry is about sort of working with that and making that something that can be sort of understood through the senses. Very often, obviously people work in poetry in lots of different ways, but that I suppose is my angle on it in that area. And then you're asking too about decolonization and decolonizing the mind, and kind of looking to sort of non-dominant languages and indigenous languages. I should say, I'm not an expert in sort of translating from indigenous languages or anything like that, but I am interested in those relationships between languages, and I think in poetry it's very clear that certain indigenous traditions do give us some different way of thinking about relationships, which is immensely important, because it's outside of the kind of the Western kind of extractive framework that we're completely locked into very often. And actually translation can also be part of that, which makes it even more complicated. And so even the translation of for example marginalized languages, that can sort of cause problems in terms of the power relations in play. So even then it's not easy. But I just wanted to mention an example of that, recently. So sort of how can this work? How can poetry work as a way of kind of opening those channels? I think particularly it forms communities and international communities, and often indigenous languages have a very special place in those. So I'm thinking, for example, of poetry festivals, particularly in Latin America, that I've had the chance to attend and have been really, really fascinating in that context. And so, for example, the Medellin Poetry Festival in Colombia, they do a lot of work just really connecting people from many, many different cultures and languages, and forming communities that are kind of connected through translation. And one poet I met through that was the Quechua poet Yana Lucila Lema Otavalo. And so we were not communicating in her language, Quechua, we were communicating through very bad Spanish, but it was poetry that was giving us the kind of impetus to try and communicate something, and her poems were translated. And so it becomes this point of contact. And then during the pandemic, I had the opportunity to work with her to talk about what we were experiencing in different places. She was in Ecuador, I was on Anglesey, and just trying to translate a poem through Spanish from Quechua to English, and knowing that it was really a very kind of chancy and difficult process, that I couldn't really represent her language, that I was just trying to understand something about her perspective. It was really kind of enormously enlightening, I think, partly because of the way that she was articulating her experience of community, her experience with place, her experience of the pandemic, which was so different from where I was. And so in a way it was not just the fact that she was seeing it differently from where she was within her Otavalo community, but also that there was this conversation mediated through poetry that enabled us to think, well, what was she hearing around her? How was she thinking? We were talking about birds, in fact, again, and she was talking about the small birds that were coming out in the lockdown, and I was talking about being surrounded by gulls. And so we were kind of exchanging these ideas, but from vastly different and totally totally kind of unequal perspectives in lots of ways. And so, one is always aware of the kind of difficulty of doing that. And then also, I suppose, we're aware that we're communicating, for example, through, I think we were talking on Zoom. And so what does that mean? What are those wires going under the Atlantic made of? And who's had to mine the copper that made that possible? And so you have this conversation between two localities, and yet there are so many aspects of that conversation that you also might want to critique, and so that becomes part of sort of how you might think of that as well. Just what's the kind of the material basis for how we can communicate? How did we meet in the first place? It was by me flying a very long way, so we might think about sort of global community and these valuable insights that we might get from a kind of indigenous language that has this sort of idea of animism still very alive in it. And yet what does it take for us to actually experience that or work with it? That simply opens up more questions. So yeah, I guess that is one example of why it's both a kind of a rich area to think about, but also quite a complicated one.
Right, certainly. Thank you so much. Fantastic. So now in this,
Gregor, can I say something?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah.
So what I'm thinking about is that all of us are speaking about translation, but in different ways, right? This is that translation from one human language to another, but actually implicated in a whole system of translations, also the material to the vocal, all of these things. Alexandra was talking about translations of academic insights to organizations, to humans being receptive. We also spoke about translations between human languages and animal languages. And I think that all of these translations are kind of a practice of becoming more worldly. So I like this, actually, this idea of translation also as a kind of tool that we can use in thinking about ecological intelligence. And one other thing I was thinking about is that much of this is also about pluralizing meaning. I think that as humans, we always have a tendency to go back to what we know and create one fixed idea of meaning, but all of us also keep drawing attention to sort of widening this notion of meaning. And specifically, I was thinking about non-human animal poetry, because this is a question I get after I give talks about animals and language. Do they make jokes? Yes, they do. Do they have morality? Yes, they do. At least that people are researching that. Do they have poetry? We don't know, you know. Because a lot of things that people like about animal languages, for example, birdsong is very beautiful. And they think that the birds are creating music, but they're actually often just talking to each other, right? But then a lot of that we don't understand. Whales sing love songs that last for 20 hours. I think there's a lot of poetry in there, but we don't know what they're saying. So that's just sort of a short note. But yeah, the issue of translation could be useful in thinking about it.
Can I build on that? Sorry, because I'm reading
sure.
the plan.
That's lovely.
But while I was listening to Eva, I thought that this translation, which is such a powerful notion, especially for actor network theory, and Bruno Latour, you've mentioned him, Grzegorz, in your lecture. Translation, in my opinion, is also the mean or the tool to get to the new social but transhuman ontology, because thanks to translation, you can really experience being decentered, because you know that everything is in motion and could be translated to another person on another being experience. So I think that making translation one of the tool of building ecological intelligence is really the mean how we can get to the situation that we really experience new ontology, like in Hart and Negri, new institutionalization of the common, for example. We know that we need new institutions, new habits, new approaches to many things. So I really believe that translation is the way we can get there, and to understand that we are interconnected, and even more, we are interdependence. I really love this word. I cannot pronounce it super correctly, but I think that this word is super powerful, because it means that I need all those other beings to be where I am and to act as I'm acting, because I'm not alone, I'm not separated. And if you now you have another question, so I will pause right now and I will wait for your third question, Grzegorz.
That's okay. We could really get this moving, but since you ask, all right. So I think that translation is indeed one of the really important concepts here, and I think I really liked that Julia also brought up this question of translation and emphasized its imperfect character, and in a sense, perhaps it is the imperfect nature of translation that actually makes it so valuable, because there is some margin of resistance or difference that is inherent to translation. And yes, I would say that indeed through translation we become earthlings, if I can put it that way, right? So thanks so much for that. I think that we can move to a more open-ended section of the discussion, where we can connect the dots whichever way you wish. But there is a question that I thought was very important, was a kind of an elephant in the room question, and it was the first question that I actually came up with when the panel was still, you know, in the very early stages of its composition. And it is the question whether ecological imagination is ultimately compatible with capitalism, whether in the face of, you know, runaway climate change, we have time to debate this, whether, you know, whether we should not be working towards, you know, different solutions or different approaches. So so that's a kind of, you know, a kind of a big Pandora's box I'd like us to open, right? So if you could share some of your thoughts on that, that'd be perfect.
And I will be first. This is very risky question, especially for a person who is working for public institutions. So, but I will be radical right now. I don't think that we can combine capitalism in this form and ecological intelligence. So that is my first sentence. The second is, I'm always wondering why it's so close. It's so close and easy to cooperate between the governments and political institutions and science. So they are much closer than political institutions and art. Like, it's oversimplification, but I'm talking from my perspective. So I'm thinking that the reason is, and when I was listening to you both, I really think that I'm right, that poetry is so powerful. It's like dynamite. So it really can change people's mindset, because their poetry is exposing people to feeling. And when you were talking, Grzegorz, in your lecture about this science with the capital letter, this science is super close to state, to power, to government, to capitalism, but it's super far from art, because this type of art, like poetry, is giving the power of resistance to people. So people like using poetry can be much more resistance to the current order. So I think that this is for a reason why political institutions, they prefer to be in a safety zone with big science, not with radical space with poetry and art, because this element of resistance is so intensively there. So I believe that if we really, and we are trying sometimes in our organization to really make some space for different form of creating policies. And I believe that if we incorporate more art into policy space, this bottom-up emancipation will appear finally, and people will understand that it's not even possible to connect GDP and ecological intelligence. But right now, people are not so sure if they understand all elements. So we have to create them the conditions that they will connect the dots, and they will give us this answer. That's all from me. Sorry, my radical voice was speaking right now.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, because also, yeah, you're talking about the arts as kind of forming a kind of resistance or resilience in terms of communities, which I think is really interesting. And so, and what you're not saying there is that it's the kind of the medium for communicating something. So you're putting it in a really kind of different place. And I think, and I think that's important, because I mean, I was listening to the very interesting panel before this one, where you know, there was a comment. So yeah, I think you know, George Marshall was commenting that, you know, climate poetry is not going to get us very far in communicating the kind of urgency of climate change, and that if you want to communicate, then maybe football, soap opera, TV drama would be better. And these, but I think very often, you know, mass media is sort of instrumentalizing communication, and it's very kind of tied into those that drive towards progress and profit and accumulation and extraction. And the other thing that happens within that is that it's constantly disguising itself. And I think that is one of the main problems that we have, that actually sort of the solutions of neoliberal capitalism may look utopian, they may look plausible, they may promise something to us, but when we really start to think about those connections and relationships, we realize that it's the whole system that needs to change. And so for me, I think this idea of the ecological imagination is one that invites us to make visible the connections, make visible what it depends on. And so when I was talking about the copper wires, connecting my Zoom call with Jana when we were working on her poem, I was also thinking particularly of work by Jennifer Scapitoni, and a really interesting sort of poet and multimedia artist, who's worked on exactly this. And, this idea of the thing that we call the cloud, which sounds like a kind of natural phenomena, it is in fact this, this sort of highly sort of polluting and environmentally sort of costly kind of network of data farms, and so how do we understand this materiality, and that is underneath what we're doing now, and making that evident is part of the ecological imagination, but it's in conflict with the promise of easy communication and constant progress that we're being offered, which is also helpful to us, because look at us talking now. We also use it. We're absolutely inside it, and that's the other thing. And we are inside neoliberal capitalism and its forms, and that's the other sort of difficult paradox of this situation. But we also need to see it for what it is.
Yeah, thanks to both of you. I agree with the things that you say about capitalism, and also I'm glad that you resist instrumentalization of art and poetry, because that's it, right? It's seen then as a fix, so it sort of fits into the system, but it can also function as a challenge. I was thinking about the other part of your question, Gregor. Are we too late? Huh? How should we? I think that. The German philosopher Ernst Bloch wrote about about hope in a political sense, and he says that we need to learn to hope. So, and with that he means that we need to learn to hope as a political practice. So, not as individuals, but as communities, and as a really important aspect of learning to hope. He sees imagining utopias, different kinds of futures. And I think that also connects to the things that we were discussing earlier. So how can these different ways, or these different viewpoints on the world help us think collectively about alternatives to the status quo, alternatives to capitalism, but also alternatives to the exploitation of the earth and living with other animals. And I think that part of this might be in the story, like discussing other stories. But I think that one of the other things that came up today is that we also need to develop different kinds of practices to think about this together. Yeah, that was a very valuable insight from what you both discussed today. So, but yes, our duty to, I'm not very hopeful individually, but I think that politically and democratically, we do need to learn to hope in better ways, because very often the climate crisis is also sort of narrated as a kind of catastrophe that will destroy everything anyway. So what's the use of writing poetry in 2021 or 2022? But I think that there is a a need.
Right. Thank you so much. That was very insightful. Yeah, and my last question concerns joy, because this is something that is very important for all of us. This is something that was mentioned in the previous panel. This is something that Julia Fiedorczuk has mentioned in her lecture, and I find this very, very important. I like to finish on that note. So I wanted to ask you, can this ecological intelligence that we're talking about unlock certain unknown pleasures, other modes of satisfaction and happiness, things that perhaps we forgot about, or things that we have not even considered so far? So do you have any any idea whether whether it pushes us towards new joys?
I'd like to just comment on something I've thought a lot about recently. Since I was working with Julia on the presentation of one of her poems in translation, as it happens, for school kids, and she did a recording of some of her poems where she kind of takes on the body of an animal, and then and kind of thinks about what it would be like to inhabit that. And they are from her book Oxygen, and they're wonderful poems, and I really enjoyed that permission in her work to kind of think about a world of shared senses with animals. And I think perhaps before thinking about that with her, I'd always been a bit afraid of assuming too much from an animal's point of view, and I think her thought that animals also they're hungry, they have energy, and share this space with us. And I think about that every morning when I go for a walk around my town and watch the squirrels, and that gives me a great deal of joy. But it's a joy that is also informed by thinking through poetry, and actually particularly through Julia's, who is somebody I know through translating poetry, and is part of that extended community. And I would say that these extended friendships, often through text, sometimes with people I know, sometimes with people I haven't met, I've just read their work, that that in itself is joyful, that you feel that you're in this kind of shared space. And then you can also discover new ways to think about actually where you are, and your immediate encounters with others. And for me, particularly in these sort of months of lockdown, living in my locality, the creatures I encounter around me have also been important in terms of sustaining that joy.
Yeah, I just want to briefly continue on that point of seeing those other beings as the other beings that they are. As I mentioned earlier, I wrote a book about animal languages, and I think in general there's kind of in biology, but also ethology, a turn towards the animals. So for a very long time, animals were mostly studied on the basis of whether or not they resembled humans. So animal language was studied on either if these animals could speak in human language or if they could understand it. And now there's kind of a turn towards their modes of being, their ways of engaging with the environment, and so on. And for writing that book, I was just reading so many studies about how animals communicate with one another, how they experience their surroundings, what kind of social relationships they have with one another, the kind of love affairs that they might have. Being in love is very funny. Lots of animals fall in love with each other. Well, they have all of these ways of caring for each other, or negotiating territories and so on. And I think that really changed my view on everything, and it's like Zoe, what Zoe says, if you go outside for a walk, you don't see the kind of random birds in the sky, but you see people creating communities in other bodies, in other ways. And that's really valuable and really nice also, because a lot of the animal rights work is quite horrific because it involves a lot of violence and a lot of destruction. But yeah, writing about animals and language was a very enriching experience. And I think once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you see all of the different communities, you just know that you're sharing the world, and it has a sort of comfort because life is hard also for us, right? The ones you love die, and there are so many things that are actually horrible. It's a very, being alive is a very difficult condition, but it's also joyful, and you share it with others, and it's comforting that they create meaning. So that is one thing that I wanted to say. And the second thing is that just briefly about veganism, a lot of people kind of frame veganism as a something meager or horrific. You know, you have to give up all of these things and your life will be, you will be one of the pale people in the back chewing on a leaf of grass or something. But I think that spiritually, which is a weird word and I don't usually use, but kind of it actually is a very enriching way of being in the world, because it sort of allows you to be more attuned to the lived realities of others who also suffer, and to be sort of to occupy a different relation in a different position in the power scheme or something. That I find also joyful. So that's just a short note to kind of counter that view.
Grzegorz, you gave us the simplest question at the end. That was very nice of you. So, of course, it's super joyful. Everything connected with building this intelligence could be and is joyful. And the first is, I would love to tell you that I truly believe, and I saw that in our processes, that when people are together, so I'm coming back to the community topic, they are happy that I'm not alone. Being decentered is happiness, because being in the center is super stressful. When you can experience that all other beings are equally important, it's also a relief and it's also a joy. Discovering and exploration, what we need here right now, it's also a joy. But you cannot be together and you cannot experience stress all the time. And also fighting for decolonization of your mind and body, when you finally succeed in that, this is also a great joy that you, for example, you are finding new language to express yourself, or you find a new way of using your body. That is also a joy. So every element of building this ecological intelligence, it's totally joyful, and we have to really concentrate on that.
Thank you so much. That was a very joyful note. So in order not to dispel this sense of, being satisfied and joyful, I think we can safely wrap it up. I wish to thank you so much for this hugely engaging and illuminating discussion. I hope that everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. So thank you to all the panelists, and of course also the panelists in the previous part, and of course to everyone who worked so hard to put this all together and make it possible, especially Climate-KIC and the School of Ecopoetics. I wish everyone a great many joys, and I hope that you stay strong and take care. So thank you so much again. Big love, and hope to see you soon, if not via Zoom then, or be live then, in person, hopefully. Thank you so much. Take care, and stay safe. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to meet you all. Thank you.
Yes, great to meet you. Bye.